So one last thing we're going to talk about is the modify section. The most common tools used in the modify are press pull, fillet, chamfer, split body, and then combine. And combine is the most interesting one. So let's quickly talk about the other ones. All of them, press pull, fillet, chamfer, can be found in the right-click menu. Most of them are contextual, but you can also find them here, press pull, fillet, and chamfer. It's just not very convenient to have them in this top bar. So the way I get to them is all of these operations. Press pull is done with a face, so it's easier to point to the face and right click and do press pull. And then if you're pointing to an edge, right click, fillet, or chamfer. Let's clean the scene, and I'm going to explain the difference between fillet and the chamfer. Well, first of all, I don't think I'm pronouncing the fillet correctly. I think I kind of changed the pronunciation based on when and how I say it. Sometimes I say fillet, sometimes I say fillet. Like when I'm using it as a verb, I say fillet. But it doesn't really matter because both fillet and the chamfer are a variation of a bevel, which is an edge treatment. So if we go to modify, you can find them right here: fillet, rule fillet, chamfer. They all have a couple of other combinations, but they basically only work on edges. And depending on what you're doing with it, it can be just an edge treatment. So right click, chamfer, that's just treating an edge. And you can change the settings. For example, do it at a different angle. Or depending on how you're using it, this can be changing the whole shape. So it's important, like it's an important tool, basically. And then, but it's still a bevel. And the other one is fillet, which is a rounded chamfer or rounded bevel. And it also has some settings, but both of them, I use both of them for edge treatment and drastically changing the form and shape of the object. So one more thing to talk about is this operation called split body. It's pretty important because it's cool to use for faking seams in products that look like they've been manufactured. So for example, or like for splitting bodies, it's directly what it's used for. But as an example, we want to split this cube into two custom shapes. And you split bodies using planes or sketches. So for example, we can draw a line that's not going to be just straight, but it's going to be a line that has some curvature, like that. If we look at it from the side, I started drawing the line on this face, and that's why it's now attached to this face. And now split body, we will have to select the body first. That's the first operation. Then split tool, it's going to be this line. Whether or not we want to extend it past the body. Basically that means extending it infinitely left and right. If I turn it off, it's only going to split that far, but in this case it doesn't matter. Click OK, and you can see this gives us two bodies. And if we want to move it, select moving bodies. You can see that we have two separate bodies. Just before we continue with the last tool in this section, I want to mention that when you're moving bodies, you can choose between selection options. So for example, selection filters. Selecting all and then all of this means that you sort of have a smart pointer that helps you select between everything at the same time, like between a face, an edge, and then to select a body, I chose this one specifically. The selection priority, I chose select body priority and put it here. If I click that now, my selection priority will be the full body. I will not be able to select an edge or a face. It's helpful when you're moving whole bodies like that, and not just, if I turn this off, not just moving faces, because if you just move a face, that is what it's going to look like, which is not what we want. And another quick remark is that if we go all the way back before we split the body, if your point, what you're trying to achieve is just cut this off, you don't really have to use split body. You can use several methods, just like I mentioned before, several ways to solve the problem. You can first just press pull this face, which will automatically select a cut operation, and it will cut it. And another one is, if we go back to the sketch, all we need to do is just complete the sketch to turn this into a face. And that way we can just press pull that face in particular and delete it, which we will talk more about as we're modeling a simple prop or just some sort of example. And for now, let's just clear the scene again. Last but not least is the combine operation. To me, it's one of the most important operations or one of the most important tools in Fusion 360. It controls all of our Boolean operations. Boolean operations are operations of adding and subtracting. So we kind of briefly touched upon it before. If we have a cube, and let's say we have another shape built separately right here, we can take this shape, and that's a very important concept to understand. So if you don't understand it, you can, after watching this, you can rewind back and watch it until you get it. We can take this shape and subtract it from any place in this body. For that, we will turn on body selection to be able to move whole bodies easier. You can see the preview of the intersection, and I'm just figuring out where exactly am I placing the body. So let's say I want it to be here. This is where I want my cut to happen. Right now, I just moved it. So these two bodies exist separately. There's no interaction between them. And this combine operation is what lets me select how these bodies are gonna interact. So I'm gonna say, because I need a cut in the shape of that cylinder, I'm gonna say the target body is gonna be the big box, the tool body is gonna be the cylinder, and the operation, it's what we talked about before when you're creating them. Join, cut, or intersect, it's gonna be a cut. So this gives us a preview. It can let us keep the tool after the operation, so it will make the cut and keep the cylinder. But I'm just gonna say just do the cut. But the magic, if we go back, the magic is that it can do a lot more complex operations, not just primitives. So for example, we can work on this cylinder and let's just say we turn this cylinder into some sort of a screw template. Just something totally random. And infinite complexity, really, as long as it all makes sense. So right now I'm building a negative of the shape that I'm going to subtract. This is going to be the negative, and this logic will you will understand it with time as you're working with Fusion, how to think in a negative shape, so to speak. So I'm just gonna move this back here. So right now it's just sitting there, and then I'm gonna perform this subtract operation, a Boolean operation. It's still technically a combine. Even if we're not combining these two bodies in an additive way, we're combining them in a subtractive way. So combine target body, tool body, make the cut, but I'm gonna say keep the tool, and I'm gonna move the tool out of the way to show you what happened. As you can see, there's this cut, and because on the tool my cylinders were extruded in the cut, what makes sense, they are subtracted. And then what's even better is we can take this further and keep working with the shape, adjusting it, etc., etc. So it's really infinite complexity. As an example, I can take this, say copy and paste it, Control C, Control V. Now I have two of those, and I'm just gonna kind of subtract it from itself, just placing it at a slightly different angle to create that weird complexity real quick. And just let's see what happens. Like this. So you can do anything you want here, but the important thing to keep in mind is, what is your target, right? What is your goal with modeling here? Is it just a concept that you're going to overpaint, or is it a mesh that's going to be used as a high poly mesh? Because leaving this mesh with such weird edges and just really weird shapes, it's not going to be very productive. It's going to be hard to retopologize. So stuff like this, you have to keep in mind. Going overboard with complexity is not always good, and we're of course going to talk about it in later lessons. So from here, I think this is about it in terms of the basic tools. We're gonna use them most, but like I mentioned before, there are some other tools in here, like both in Sketch, Create, Modify, and other ones, like in construction and inserting and selection sets. But now that you kind of have an idea, we're gonna go into chapter 4, and I'm gonna give you a demo of like just a Photoshop overpaint style of explanation, how I'm looking at the shape and I'm trying to see what kind of instrument or what kind of tool is used to achieve that shape. Just like I said, you need to have them in your library in your head to be able to know that it's applicable. And hopefully this is going to make sense in a second.